Hello and welcome. I'm David Aberbach, Director of the Seniors Program at Simon Fraser University. I moved to Canada in 1965 to become a charter member of the History Department. I'll never forget the 3,000-mile train ride I took from Montreal to Vancouver and the endlessly fascinating scenery along the way. During the 1960s, Canada's official policy was biculturalism, an equal partnership between the two founding peoples, the English and the French. But in 1971, Prime Minister Trudeau made a major change. Canada became the first country in the world to adopt multiculturalism as official policy. Joining me today are Kogila Adam-Moodley, sociologist and professor at the University of British Columbia, and Peter McKnight, an editorial writer for the Vancouver Sun. Our topic: Multiculturalism and the Canadian Identity, the Changing Faces of Canada. Let's begin with official governmental policy. I quote, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the Government of Canada to acknowledge the freedom of all members of Canadian society, to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage, and to recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism is a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian identity and heritage." What does this mean? What does this mean?
I think what it means is that this society, more than any other, offers a space in which people can be different, in which people feel comfortable using another language, conforming to another set of cultural practices or whatever it is that gives them a level of comfort. And in that loose sense, Canada has created that space.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting statement, what you read there, Alan, because it seems to be two parts. One is permitting people from various cultures to preserve and enhance their culture and so forth, as you said. The other part is about the government's role. And, this is the focus of the Multiculturalism Act is not simply allowing people to feel comfortable in their own culture, in promoting their own culture, but also puts an obligation on the government to do something to ensure the preservation and enhancement of those cultures. So I see two separate things here. One is the role of the people vis-a-vis their own culture. The other is the role of the broader society, of the government, to preserve those cultures. And I think they're two different things, and they're not necessarily incompatible, but they're certainly, both don't need to exist either.
I'm not sure about whether the government has a role in the preservation of people's culture. But what I see is that it formally facilitates people's desires to want to retain a way of life or develop the arts and so on. So it's very, very loose. If you look at the way in which multicultural policy has been implemented over time, initially it was the focus was on cultural maintenance, but there's been a gradual evolution of the role of government and its priorities. So it's moved from cultural preservation to intercultural communication and integration, those kinds of things, and then to the whole issue of racism or anti-racism. So I think there's been a shift there, and it's never been government policy to formally get involved with actual maintenance of culture, as a primary goal.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, particularly with this term preservation, because when we, to talk about preserving cultures means to keep them as they are at a certain point in time. And of course, that's not the way cultures are. I mean, culture is necessarily a dynamic thing that changes constantly as a result, in part, with communication with other cultures. So I do think there's a problem with the idea of preserving culture as opposed to facilitating communication, or as you said, integration among different cultures.
Is this a legitimate function of government?
In my view, it depends what function we're talking about. It seems to me we have two conflicting views here often. One is this idea of allowing people to make their own way in life and do what they want. Another one is to have the government become involved in that. The problem is, what we've seen is, on the one hand, we have people, this sort of American melting pot view that says, sure, people are free to do what they want. But as a government, we're still going to promote the E, and E pluribus unum, one from many. We're going to promote the one. We're going to promote those things that we have in common as Americans or as Canadians, as opposed to highlighting those differences. And so this is something, I think there's a lot of tension there, and I do question whether it is the government's role. I think it's great if the government works toward communication, intercommunication, intercultural communication, and so forth. I think it's quite another thing if the government plays a role actually in highlighting those differences between people. And that's essentially the debate we had recently with Michael Chong, the former Conservative minister, who gave up his position because he said we're focusing too much on differences. He said, I want to focus on what makes us all Canadian, what we all share, whether we're from Newfoundland or Quebec or British Columbia.
But isn't that more of an American concept, the idea of the melting pot, the idea of cultural assimilation? And we see constant attempts to enshrine English as the official language, and immigrants are expected to assimilate as quickly as possible into the American system, whereas the Canadian system, with all respect to Mr. Chong, seems to be the idea of cultural pluralism, the idea of a mosaic.
But you see, I don't see a melting pot being incompatible with the cultural mosaic. I don't. I think one can recognize one's differences, one can celebrate one's culture, and still understand the values that we all share in common as Canadians, not as, a hyphenated Canadian, this or that.
I think there's a basic difference between a melting pot and a mosaic. The melting pot, in some senses, Canada is a melting pot on a slow burner. Basically, that's really what it's about. Every new immigrant kid knows if they want to make it in this place, if they want to really succeed, there are norms that are not written, but communicated nevertheless to the way in which they imbibe what it is to be Canadian. So that part's definitely melting pot. But the mosaic part of Canada, the nice thing, is that as a group who chooses to do something a little bit different, you no longer are at the mercy of a general population which can attack you for not being Canadian. In other words, you can point to a policy. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that that's a significant difference. Whether it's the role of government to highlight differences is another question. I think, Peter. I would have some disagreement there, because I think if you look at the implementation of multicultural policy, which is actually a very small pool of funding that they have to mete out to groups, they're very careful in how they award those funds, that it doesn't actually exaggerate differences. So they're looking at all sorts of examples in applications that are made for funding, which cross-cut with other groups. There is that subtext that actually works in the way government policy is implemented.
Speaking about government policy, does it bother either of you to see the role that government is attempting to play? I brought up a little earlier, during my first few years in Canada in the mid-'60s, this deliberate attempt to create a national anthem, the deliberate attempt to create a flag, the deliberate attempt to create Canadian content. Does it bother you at all, this attempt to create multiculturalism as official policy?
Yeah, you know, I think it's a very difficult thing to do when we're talking about culture, which is something that, you know, as I said, develops over time. And to be able to plan this out, you know, to have, you know, some central planning that how our culture is going to work, I think, is not just problematic, but I think it's really not possible, because I don't think we can socially engineer culture to that extent. We can make small changes. We can, you know, highlight certain values, as we do, as the law does, as the Constitution does, and as it should. But to actually try and create a culture, I think, is a difficult thing, if not an impossible thing to do.
Well, you see, this is where I think Canada is very much a leader in the world with this policy. Look, I'm not an uncritical sort of believer in multiculturalism in the sense that I, you know, wave that flag most of all. It has all sorts of flaws, and it has some problems and so on. And, you know, your notion of culture as a stuck in stone kind of thing and is I agree. But if you look at the way in which global tendencies play out in the world, and you look at Canadian policy is very, very forward looking. The Europeans are looking to Canada as an example, because no matter what we say, multiculturalism is here to stay with us in the world. You cannot say, do we have a choice to multiculturalize or not? It's a fact of life. And so I think what Canada's done is had this sort of looseness. Don't for a moment think that this policy formally creates pressure on people to, you know, to stick in a mold and so on and so forth. It's there, and it's just that very loose thing. But nevertheless, it says that you do not have to drop everything about yourself. I don't think this government is in the business of creating culture, but it is saying, you know, for those who feel like they want to live that way, within the legal constraints of Canada, you can do it.
You bring up a fascinating question comparing Canada with certain European countries. And perhaps the one country that tried most to create a multicultural society was British. But former Prime Minister Tony Blair had some interesting comments to make regarding that. And what he had to say is, when it comes to our essential values, belief in democracy, the rule of law, tolerance, equal treatment for all, respect for this country and its shared heritage, then that is where we come together. It is what we hold in common. It is what gives us the right to call ourselves British. At that point, no distinctive culture or religion supersedes our duty to be part of an integrated, united kingdom. That's very strong language. It almost is a rejection of multiculturalism. And then finally he says, conform to it or don't come here. We don't want the hate mongers, whatever their race, religion, or creed. So it sounds as if Britain is repudiating multiculturalism, whereas Canada is trying to promote and to expand multiculturalism. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I think that's interesting. I just read that quote recently myself. And we've seen this in a number of European countries, in the Netherlands, and I believe it was Denmark, that have moved away from multiculturalism after adopting it, following Canada, and now have decided against it. Now, a lot of that in those European countries has to do with Islamism, not all Muslims, but with very fundamentalist Islamic people who have, created certain difficulties for the culture as a whole. So I see a lot of that, a lot of what we see happening in Europe, almost a return to a kind of nationalism, is essentially a response to this, to the threat of Islamic terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism. But I think underneath it, Blair's comment when he talks about, we as the United Kingdom respect tolerance, the rule of law, equal treatment of sexes and races and so forth. What he's essentially saying is, I think, really important and gets to the idea of what we mean by official multiculturalism, in that he's saying, look, we have certain values, and if people from other cultures come here and they don't share those values, that's a problem. We're not going to accommodate people who don't share belief in the rule of law, who don't believe in equal treatment of men and women and of different races. In essence, what he's saying is, we do have a culture with certain values, and we're not going to compromise on that. And I think, and Kogila, you mentioned this, you said we talk about cultures within our legal framework and so forth. I think we do have that attitude as well, in that, we also believe in things like the rule of law, like equality, and we don't tolerate, or I would argue we shouldn't tolerate, other cultures that don't believe, other cultures that, for example, believe women shouldn't go out of the house, or believe girls shouldn't go to school. Now, there are many good things about all different cultures, but we do have to recognize that we disagree fundamentally on certain values that these cultures share, and we're not going to promote that. So then my question would be, what is it we promote about other cultures as part of our policy of multiculturalism? I mean, are we promoting just music and food and clothing, or are we going to promote these values?
Yeah, good question. I think that what we're about is really, when we talk about multiculturalism, if you look at it really, really, squarely in the face, we're really perpetuating a loose thing of lifestyle. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're really looking at, you feel good doing this and that. But basically, the moment immigrants enter this society, they know they conform to certain kinds of legal dictates. I think there is no question about that.
But if I could just interject, I mean, we do have attempts by various cultures to exempt themselves from those. For example, the whole issue of bringing Sharia law, bringing Muslim people under Sharia law. What they're saying is, we don't want to follow Canadian law. We want to follow our own legal traditions.
But that's not a widely felt sentiment. If you look at the Ontario courts and their, what was a dispute resolution, things which related to the practice of Sharia law, they had to pull back on it because there was so much community pressure. Women I talked to randomly said, we gave that up over there, why would we have it here? Yeah. And here was this dialogue, interesting dialogue between provincial government and community groups, which showed you the fluidity. In other words, that community was not homogeneous, that wanted Sharia, and that is what would speak against the kind of homogenizing notion that I see coming across in your talking of culture. Do you see what I mean? The community is very diverse.
Yeah, but I agree with you completely, and I think it's an important point. And that's true with any community, right? Every community is diverse. But that to me, I mean, one of the things with multiculturalism, official multiculturalism that I see, is promotion of certain ideas about the culture, when in fact there are people within the culture who disagree. And in fact, what we consider the rules of the culture and so forth are what those in power in that culture decided. There are, of course, many people who don't agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why people come to Canada, right? They come to Canada not because they don't want to come to Canada and continue to celebrate that culture. They come to Canada to get away from that culture and to embrace the culture of Canada. I mean, this is what a lot of immigrants tell me. It's not all of them, and it's not to suggest that they don't want to bring a little bit of home with them, but they're often escaping an oppressive culture.
Peter, I don't think most people come here because they want to get away. Most people. Certainly there are some people who want to get away from community pressure, all those kinds of things. But many, many, many people come here because they want better life chances for their children.
Right.
I mean, I think that's a driving force.
But isn't that the same case in Great Britain?
Yes. I think Canada, perhaps the word that describes us better is a cosmopolitanism, because of the range of immigrant groups that we've got here, and because of the range of economic positionings of people within what we call communities. So I think that idea that, you know, they come here to get rid of.
Well, you know, my point is not. My point is that some immigrants do come to escape an oppressive culture, but also, but I agree, they're coming. They're not just running away from something; they're running towards something. And the question, well, what I would suggest is that they're running toward a culture that offers them the kind of values that they wish, such as freedom, such as the opportunity for economic success, such as equality, such as living under a country that believes in the rule of law and not the rule of people. So I would argue that a lot of people are coming to Canada because of Canada's values.
Yeah. Okay.
There was a recent letter in the Vancouver Sun, and it was, let me read it to you. The writer claims that a spirit of tolerance, equality, individualism, and freedom she sees as Western values, and she wonders if this is the case with non-Western cultures. And the question is, could our acceptance of multiculturalism as official government policy, could it create a clash of values between so-called Western and non-Western values? Do you see any problems there?
That's a very interesting point the writer's making, saying that these ideas of tolerance and so forth are Western values. Now, this to me is problematic in the sense that what it's suggesting is that values are simply a matter of where they come from, that there is no truth of the matter. It's just a matter of this culture believes in this, that culture believes in that, and who are we to judge? I mean, this is a common thing we see. I understand there's a well-meaning idea behind this in cultural pluralism, the idea of respecting other cultures and other people who think differently, who behave differently, who have different values than us. But at the same time, to suggest that we simply ought not to judge, not to ever judge another culture or another person's way of life or values, is to me problematic. It leads into this whole idea of what we call cultural relativism, right? That values are simply relative to a culture, that there's no truth of the matter about it, that no values are better than any other. And I think that's problematic. And it's something that has really been taught a lot in Western culture over the last 20, 30 years. To the point where I have actually talked to university students who have told me that they disagree with what the Nazis did, but that they have no right to judge that culture. They say, I don't believe in what they did, but it might have been right for them to do it. Now, that's extreme, but that's the general attitude. If we start taking values as simply being relative to a culture, rather than saying, as we do, I would argue, as we do in Canada, say, there are certain values that we're not going to mess with. We're not going to mess with values of equality. We're not going to mess with the rule of law. We're not going to mess with tolerance. And I think it's important that we're able to say that and not say, this is simply a cultural bias and nothing more.
But how far are we willing to go?
That's the question.
This is, and it raises another question, and I have another letter also that appeared in the Vancouver Sun. And this writer asks, what do we mean when we say that Canada respects all cultures and traditions? Does this mean that we respect cultures that force women to wear veils, or permit honor killings, or child brides, or polygamy? And that raises the question that you were just talking about. Should we respect the values of all cultures? Because that is official Canadian policy, to respect the values of all cultures. How far do we go in this?
Right. And, you know, I would say that might be official Canadian policy in terms of how it's written, but certainly not in terms of how it's implemented. Because we have recognized that, right? We have recognized that there are many cultures that the way in which they treat people you know, is something that we are not willing to accept. Now, the other thing is, I would go back to my point about it depends what we mean by the culture and the cultural values, because often, as I say, these are defined by the victors, right? They're defined by the people in power. The Taliban defined how they wanted their culture in Afghanistan to live. No doubt there were many people, men and women, who disagreed with that, and many of them, in fact, you know, we have Afghan refugees who left precisely for that reason. So this is, to me, another problem is there's no question Canada is not going to accept all the values of all cultures. But furthermore, we have to be careful when we talk about what the values of those cultures are. Are they values that are being impressed upon them by people in power, or are these things to which the people actually assent? Now there are cases where I would say the majority of people in a culture do assent to a certain thing. But I would also argue that a value is not correct simply because the majority of people believe in it. If that were the case, we'd never have a change in values, right? America would have never gone from being a country supporting slavery to opposing it, because if the majority of people supported slavery, that would mean it must be right. So we do have to recognize that there are certain values that simply are wrong.
Yeah, but you see, don't you think that we're really not interrogating very carefully what we consider to be culture? We're talking about Western culture, and we've had these wonderful qualities you talked about: individualism, tolerance, all these kinds of things. Is racism part of Western culture because it has happened in Western societies? Well, you know, in the same way that we're talking about, you know, violations of gender, is sexism part of Western culture? Because if you look at major players in the political realm and in the public sphere, women are not there, you know. So, I mean, we need to look at how even gender bias exists within the so-called, you know, ethereal realm of Western culture. So, you know, when does an aspect which is retrogressive, like racism and so on, which is part of the history of this society, as it is of many societies, when does it become considered, in our sense, as being part of the culture?
The letter really suggests that there are various, and Peter, you were alluding to this, what role does government play in deciding where to draw the line, and how do you draw the line that this is acceptable and this is unacceptable? And you take a look at here in British Columbia or Canada, we now accept same-sex marriages, yet we don't accept polygamy.
I wanted to respond to something Kogila said, and I think it's an important point she brings up about, you know, the fact that we are certainly not free of racism, of patriarchal attitudes towards women and so forth. And that there is, of course, a danger in stereotyping other cultures because of some aspects they have in terms of their treatment of women or treatment of other races and so forth. To me, we have an ideal. The ideal says that we ought to treat people equally. We often fall short of that ideal, as people do. But that's our ideal, and that's something that I think we're saying we won't compromise. If there is another culture that says, well, no, we think women ought to stay at home, that would become a problem for us. We're talking here about the difference between our ideal and our practice. And so we would expect of other cultures that they have those ideals, those basic ideals of tolerance, equality, rule of law, and so forth. They may fall short of it, we may fall short of it, but the question is, do they hold that as an ideal? Is that what they're striving toward or not? And if they're not striving toward that sort of thing, Canada says we won't accept that. I mean, we really do say that. So in essence, what we're saying is you do need to accept our fundamental values. Regardless of our talk about multiculturalism, we're saying you have to accept our fundamental values. We are not going to promote a culture that doesn't, that conflicts with those values.
I have a quotation from official Government of Canada internet web page, and I'd like to see what your comment is on this. The Canadian experience has shown that multiculturalism encourages racial and ethnic harmony and cross-cultural understanding and discourages ghettoization, hatred, discrimination, and violence. Is it not true that we have had very little of hatred and violence in comparison, certainly, to European countries?
Yeah, certainly the recent example of France and what has happened in French cities offers, a remarkable comparative look for us. And you have to look at the way in which groups have been marginalized. Fortunately, Canada has escaped that this far, in the sense that they haven't created a French ghetto-type situation. To what extent that is formally government policy or intention, or to what extent we've just been fortunate that there is some mobility and that people get out of places and then are upwardly mobile, these are the factors we need to take into account.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's an important point. It's an open question: how much is government policy, and how much perhaps is a Canadian psyche, whatever that might be, that might say really good things about the Canadian people, whether they're born here or born elsewhere and come here. I think there's no question that we have been very successful. One of the most multicultural countries in the world, and with very little racial, ethnic, cultural strife. I think we've done a really good job at that. As I say, I don't know how much is a result of multiculturalism, but I would say this is just as you're saying, you're not uncritical of multiculturalism. Well, I'm not entirely unsupportive of official multiculturalism. I think that this idea of increasing intercultural communication and understanding is really important in the sense that it can broaden our horizons. Those of us, people like me, who were born in Canada and grew up in Canada, and this is what I know, can learn about different ways of seeing the world from different cultures, and so can people like me who grew up in Canada. What I think it was a German social philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer said, we can have a fusion of horizons by bringing these different people in, so we can actually see further than we might otherwise see because we have communication with other cultures. I think that's all good. How much official multiculturalism is responsible for the fact that we have this little strife, I don't know. But I do think the idea of understanding these other cultures, being respectful of these other cultures, tolerance, acceptance, which I would argue are Canadian values, whether they come from multiculturalism or not, I think those are fundamental in allowing us to live together and to learn from each other.
Can we have cultural diversity and still maintain a Canadian identity? Do you see any conflict between cultural diversity and the fact that we are a nation?
I think cultural diversity is Canadian identity.
It is the Canadian identity.
Yeah, and it's a forerunner in the world. Every single society in the world has people from other spaces. Even though, for example, countries like Germany and France don't refer to themselves as immigrant societies, they have these people. They don't know what to do with them, And so I think cultural diversity is Canadian identity.
Yeah, I would agree entirely. In fact, you stole my line there. But I would agree, and in fact, I would say that the cultural diversity in Canada reflects these values that I've been talking about, reflects the Canadian values of tolerance, of equal treatment, and so forth. And so that's why I would say, yes, that is Canadian culture is defined by cultural diversity, which is a product of the values that we hold dear.
Former politician Michael Ignatieff commented this way. He said, Canada is a most successful and enduring multinational, multilingual, liberal democratic federation on earth. Our divisions are a source of strength, not weakness. Would you agree? The most successful and enduring multinational, multilingual, liberal, democratic federation on earth. And the divisions are a source of strength, not weakness.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And what I would say, first of all, I would say we are certainly one of the most successful multicultural societies that I know of, and I don't know every country. But I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, and this goes back to your question, Alan, about creating a national identity through law, through various acts, through having a flag. I think what's really happened in Canada that hasn't happened in a lot of countries, including European countries, is that people have really internalized these values. It's not simply a matter of writing a law, writing down the charter, which I think has had a tremendous impact and largely a good impact on Canada. But in any case, it's not simply a matter of writing that down and saying, this is what we believe. Rather people believe it. There's often a debate about, does the law create the social values we have, or is the law a product of what we believe? And while a lot of people think you can change people's behavior simply by making a law, I've often argued that, in fact, the law is more often a response to what we believe. And so in essence, those values that are in our Constitution, in our Charter, are things that people really have internalized. And in fact, that may have come about as a result of these things that we believe in terms of respect, tolerance, belief in equality of peoples. And I think it's because of that. It's because of the Canadian psyche, as I said before, because of the values that Canadians hold, not the values that the Canadian government holds or the statutes, but the values that Canadians hold have made it possible for us to be such a successful multicultural society.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, but I'm a little uncomfortable with the totally adulatory tone of that. I mean, it's clearly...
Well, he is a politician.
It's clearly a political speech, So let's look at the dark side as well as the good side. Clearly, Canada has a lot to commend itself, but it's also got a lot of shady stuff that goes on. The good thing is that you work towards trying to change it. I think that's also part of Canadian culture.
We are aware of these questions. There is a dialogue going on. It isn't as if we're putting it under the carpet and not discussing it. And so at least the issues are being aired and being discussed. And although progress sometimes goes very slowly, it always seems to be heading in that right direction. And we're just hoping that it will continue in that right direction. Well, we've barely touched the surface of this question, and it's a good question. I'd like to thank Peter McKnight of the Vancouver Sun, Kogila Adam-Moodley, Professor of Sociology at UBC. Thank you both, and good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.